Steelers fans, Ben Roethlisberger had a lot to say on his own podcast about Kenny Pickett. We'll break down what he said and get you my response, along with Alan Saunders of SteelersNow.com. Then we'll get you ready for OTAs with setting up as OTAs do open up Tuesday. It's all that and more here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things on the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find this show on your favorite podcasting app and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making the Locked On Steelers podcast your first listen every day, because we're your team every day. And as always, you can donate to our Cystic Fibrosis Foundation campaign that we have going on here. To do so, just use the QR code that's on screen or go to the link that is attached in the description of this podcasting episode, whether you're listening on the podcasting app or watching on YouTube. As I said before, we're joined by Alan Saunders. He's back on the show. Alan, we gotta delve into this Ben Roethlisberger stuff, man, because it was a sunny morning in Pittsburgh that I woke up to, and I thought Monday, I was like, man, this is going to be a beautiful week, OTAs. I'm going to be going to practice. It's during nice sunny days, not cold, cloud, rainy days like I've had at Pitt practices. And then I see the Ben episode, and I'm like, uh-oh, what did he say about Pickett? Uh-oh, what did he say about Kenny Pickett? And then the firestorms of Twitter start happening, and people that are against Ben and people that are for Ben and all this other things here. But let's boil down what was said in this whole situation. Ben Roethlisberger admitted that there was a bit of selfishness on his part, that he was rooting against Kenny Pickett and the Steelers when he first started out. And he said that Kenny Pickett won him over. He even said that he thinks that Kenny Pickett is the future, and he's excited for him, and talked about rooting for him in his own basement where he records his show, Footballin with Ben Roethlisberger. I want to encourage everyone, if you want to actually get the words of Ben Roethlisberger, go to the show and watch him and listen to him say it. It's much better to get that context from him than just to read it on a screen, because if you read it on a screen, sometimes I think that people get look at it, it can be very easily turned into a very negative connotation here. And I still think that there's certain criticisms you can make of Ben Roethlisberger here. But Alan, in large, I felt like this was Ben being honest in a way that was also kind of, he was admitting like, hey, I was wrong for feeling selfish and rooting against you. You are that guy. And I think it says a lot about Kenny Pickett that he got him to believe in him. With Ben Roethlisberger's ego.
Yeah, if you go to the podcast, you're like, oh my gosh, it's an hour and a half long. It's at the very end. So just, we can like an hour and a half. Just like, well, listen to the last 5 minutes. You'll get it. I think first of all, look, I'm a reporter. I talk to players. I get canned quotes all the time from people that don't mean what they're talking about. And nobody likes that. Nobody wants to hear that. So I appreciate Ben Roethlisberger's honesty. Sort of seemed like, the question kind of caught him off guard, and he just said, hey, I'm going to say how I feel. I think the idea that if you're a player or really in any job and you kind of get forced out and there's this feeling, whatever you want to call it, a resentment, or, maybe just like, you just don't want to see the next person come in and do better than you did, right? Like you don't want to feel that way. I think all that's pretty natural. The part that kind of just stands out to me is that it's very clear that Ben Roethlisberger wanted to keep playing quarterback, and Ben Roethlisberger felt like he could have kept playing quarterback, and I'm not quite sure I can get on board with that idea.
But see, these are the few things that I take away from this that I'm like, okay. Whereas I give Ben the grace that shows really, I think that shows honesty, that he was really to come out and to admit that. Instead, I'm right with you on a few things. One, he did not have more in him. I mean, you go back and look at that year. Yes, he had some he had a lot of game-winning drives that year, but you go back and you look at how the Steelers won most of those games in 2021. It was on the back of a defense that in only one of their wins in that season did an opponent score more than 20 points. And going back throughout those games, it was the defense and TJ Watt who had a defensive MVP season that led the Steelers throughout that. And again, it doesn't mean that Ben Roethlisberger doesn't deserve credit for what he contributed during those games, because he did contribute with several, I think, clutch moments. And that was the biggest factor that he could bring to the table, was that when the game was on the line, he was used to that, and he wasn't a young guy panicking in the moment like some players do in the NFL, like most players do in sports. But I look at that year, and it was obvious to anyone who was being objective about it, and it was like that was it. That was the last bit of stuff he had in the tank. And even listen, I get the idea that players in general, if you don't go out on top, if you didn't win the title in your last year, in a year that you knew that this was kind of it anyways, you feel like, man, what if I could do one more? What if I could do one more? These athletes build their lives on beating the people who defy them, people who say that you can't do this, they do that. And so it's tough to turn that off at the end of your career and do that. And I think that Ben Roethlisberger's honesty here opens a discussion for that. But I'm just sitting here like, wait a minute, you were rooting against the team that paid you $267 million over 18 years and made you the longest tenured football player for a single team in NFL history, and did everything right by you, even when you had 2 sexual assault allegation cases and you had the motorcycle accident. And again, they didn't get rid of you when they could have in 2019, when his elbow went bad and everyone was kind of like, yeah, he's done. They let him come back for 2 years. To me, that's the only thing that I'm just like, why were you even feeling that way? But again, I think it's big of him, or at least good of him, to be able to say, that was wrong of me. I was selfish, and I'm here now. I'm past that.
I think it's one of those very rare times where I think you can apply real life to sports. I think people try to do this way too often, and it almost never works. But I really do think this is a situation, because it's all feelings, right? That's all it is. It's just feelings, okay? Mm-hmm. Where you can think about, like, man, if I had my job for 18 years and then the company was like, yeah, look, you've been kind of the last couple of years. We're going to go a different direction. Here's the new guy we're bringing to replace you. How would you feel about that person? How would you feel about that company, that situation? Like, mm-hmm. I think it is a bit more like real life than sports usually are. And I think it's a place that people can try to put themselves in that position. And I'd like to think that if I did my job for 18 years and did it really well, and there was somebody younger that was going to take the job, that I think I'd be, gracious and hope they did well and try to help them if I could. I also thought it was really, really interesting that, Ben earlier in the podcast sort of went out to Kenny and was like, what was the relationship like with Mitch Trubisky? Because it was so important for me to have, guys like Charlie Batch and Byron Leftwich that were there for me, that helped me develop. And I'm like, man, like the juxtaposition of these two things, right? Ben is talking about like how it was so important for him to have people like, kind of help him along. But then, we all saw the relationship between Mason Rudolph. Obviously, that wasn't a very good one. Can't think, given what he just said, it would have been a real nice, friendly relationship if Kenny Pickett had come onto the team while Ben was still there, right? Like, woo! Ben is at the same time saying like, oh, that's really important, but also I'm not that guy, and so I don't know. I don't think the net of this makes Ben Roethlisberger look very good, but at least it does make him look human, and I applaud his honesty, and I'm glad that he seems to have embraced Kenny, and this isn't going to be a thing. Like a Terry Bradshaw situation where there's this frostiness between a former player in the club for reasons, and it doesn't seem like that's going to happen here. But definitely not what I was expecting out of that interview, and interesting.
If anything else, I think it just proves that whether it's on the field or on his podcast, Ben Roethlisberger shoots from the hip. He just that is just who he's going to be.
100%. Yeah, which the last thing I want to say about that is like everybody's always like, oh, why don't they bring Ben back as coach? It's like, this guy don't plan anything. He don't even plan his podcast. It's like, come on. How is he the coach of anything?
He's just like, yeah, we're just gonna say this.
Yeah, we're just gonna say stuff. Let's do it.
Oh man. We're gonna get more to what I think is important about this too, is the Kenny Pickett aspect of this, how he handled the moment, and what I think all of this says about him, that he could win over Ben Roethlisberger, who admittedly wasn't keen on people that could be his successors or replacements. More on that and some preparing for OTAs in just a minute here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Don't go anywhere. But first, before we do any of that, I want to talk to you guys about our great sponsors at FanDuel Sportsbook. And of course, FanDuel Sportsbook is the number one place to go make bets on all things sports, and especially right now on the NBA playoffs, which the Denver Nuggets have clinched their way to the NBA Finals. The Miami Heat are playing the Boston Celtics Tuesday night to see if they can sweep their way into the finals as well, and that can be locked in. But the way that you can make money off of all of this is by going to FanDuel Sportsbook right now, America's number one sportsbook. And if you haven't signed up already, FanDuel is giving new customers a no-sweat first bet, which gives you up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up today and learn about your no-sweat first bet, and you can bet on anything. For how many points Jimmy Butler's going to score, is Nikola Jokic going to get another triple-double, who's going to win it all these things can be bet on right on FanDuel Sportsbook, and it's all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Don't miss your shot at a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today by going to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. Make every moment more with FanDuel, America's number one sportsbook. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Alan Saunders of SteelersNow.com. Alan, I want to kind of not be as much on Ben's comments here, but kind of also get back to the point that, the Steelers seem mighty confident in Kenny Pickett, and that's great. The organization should, because there's teams like the Titans who drafted a quarterback that same year and now have already drafted another quarterback.
They don't seem confident in any of theirs.
Right. There's just no confidence in Ryan Tannehill, Malik Willis, and probably not Will Levis either, because they didn't draft him in the first round. But back to Kenny Pickett, the Steelers have expressed that confidence. I think it says a lot that Ben Roethlisberger was kind of admitting that, yeah, I wasn't rooting for you to be the guy, but you are the guy. And he basically said that on his podcast. And I think that says a lot about Kenny Pickett, that he continues to win over people, even though it wasn't the greatest stats year. Like, it wasn't a year where the average person can just come out and say, "Oh yeah, Kenny Pickett, he's gonna be the guy." He threw 7 touchdowns and 9 interceptions. His passer rating at the end of the year was 76.7. And so you look at that and you're like, that's not great. He's not going to be a legendary quarterback. But I think more and more people who study his tape and study to see what he was doing within the Steelers schemes find confidence that he could step up and be the franchise quarterback that leads the Steelers into the future. What do you think does this say anything to you about Kenny Pickett, or you think this is just, hey man, Ben's just gonna say what he's gonna say?
I mean, I think it certainly adds to reason for optimistic feelings, and we've talked before about how I feel like the Steelers this offseason are a little bit underrated, and I think most of that comes from people not really seeing this growth from Kenny Pickett. I mean, if you look at the way the Steelers offense changed from about week 9 or 10 on, in terms of their yards per play and their efficiency, like, they weren't putting up huge numbers, but there were these so obvious strong signs of growth. And then, the late drives, which of course is going to catch the eye of a guy like Ben Roethlisberger, who was sort of known for that throughout his career. But I just think there's so many reasons to be optimistic about Kenny Pickett. We're seeing now, Mike Tomlin talking about his work ethic. Like, those of us that covered him at Pitt, I think that was the thing that we all were like, well, I don't know if his arm is good enough, but he's 100% on everything else, right? Like, he is that guy in terms of leadership and work ethic and film study and desire to be great. And so I don't know why anyone would be like, I think just the NFL world is a way too low on Kenny Pickett right now. But I think, well, look, if Ben was willing to say what he said earlier, like minutes earlier, I think we should take some stock in his evaluation that he thinks Kenny Pickett is the real deal and is going to be the next Steelers franchise quarterback, because he was clearly not in the mood to be sugarcoating things, right? Like, if he didn't believe that, he wasn't going to say it. He was going to say, I don't know, good luck. We'll see. I'm rooting for you. Get him, Tiger. Like, that's not what he said, though. He gave a pretty glowing endorsement, and I think there's lots of reasons to think that's accurate. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's – it doesn't change how I feel about Kenny Pickett, but I think it's good to see that someone who's not necessarily tied to that organization, not collected a paycheck from it anyway, is out there saying the same things a lot of people that are inside that building are saying.
Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, it's still just all that matters is what the Steelers believe, because they're the ones that are going to be planning around him, organizing around him, and working with him. But let's talk about Kenny Pickett and how he's going to approach the first OTAs that he's going to run, where he's going to be the guy. Last year when he came to OTAs, it was just, how does Kenny Pickett look like? Oh, that ball he threw, oh, that's a professional ball. And people wondering, would he be the third string, the second string, the first string? There's no questions anymore. He's the guy, and he's had off-season workouts. How do you think Kenny Pickett is going to approach OTAs this week when we get our first chance to talk to him? We know that one of the first questions he's going to get asked is about that podcast and what Ben said. But you and I know Kenny Pickett. We covered him in college. We've seen him there. He's going to brush that off and make that such a non-deal. I think what's going to be interesting is going to be seeing how much more fluid does he look with his receivers in timing, in just being a step ahead and maybe expanding upon what we saw from him last year.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of the things that he talked about in that podcast too was just, the number of coverages that get thrown at you at the NFL level is very different than in college, and that took a lot of his preparation time. And so it was not necessarily about him working every week to get better. It was working every week to get ready to do his job. And I think OTAs are a place where, okay, there's no opponent this week, right? This is all just about getting better. And I think that'll be a good opportunity for him to show some of that. I think when you look at his Pitt career and you see the big jump that occurred from that fourth season to that fifth season in his productivity, I really, truly think the biggest thing that happened there was that he, for the first time in his career, really felt a lot of confidence, a lot of faith, and was just on an innate level on the same page with his wide receivers, Jordan Addison, Taysir Mack, Jared Wayne. Those were his guys. He had known them for a while. They brought each other's games to a different level. And I think OTAs are a great opportunity to show some of that. Kenny's had the guys down in Florida already this offseason. He's showing the leadership part of it. Now he needs to show that sort of fine detail, confidence, fitting throws into tight windows, anticipating when guys are going to get open. Those are the things that separate, good quarterbacks from great ones, especially guys that, like Pickett, do not have this sort of otherworldly howitzer of an arm where he's just beating people with pure arm talent. That's the kind of quarterback he has to be. And so I'm really interested to see how the work goes with guys like Deontay Johnson and George Pickens, who he didn't really work with at this time last year, right? I mean, Pickens a little bit, but certainly not Deontay Johnson, certainly not Pat Freiermuth. Those guys were with the first team and Pickett was with the third team. So this is really his first shot at this, and I think it's going to be an important time period for him in this offense.
I agree. It's going to be very important, and I think it's going to be interesting to see, again, how far do they come along with their chemistry, their timing, and these are things that you really still can't tell too much in OTAs. It's still just football in shorts.
I mean, that is one of the. I feel like timing between the quarterback and the receiver is one of the things you can kind of judge a little bit, because it's not. Because the opponent doesn't matter, right? It's just Deontay came out of his break and the ball was right there in his hands.
That's true.
Okay, that's different. That's new. I didn't see that last year. I think that is something you can see. I'm also interested to see what, does the offense look exactly the same? Are there going to be changes? Or are there, some things that, are a bit more? Look, I mean, I don't think there's a ton of difference between Kenny Pickett and Mitch Trubisky in terms of their physical person, but there's obviously going to be preference stuff that they're going to be putting in from day one for Kenny Pickett instead of putting together an offense for Mitch Trubisky like they were doing this time last year.
No, I agree. Yeah, I think that there's going to be a lot that's going to be thrown in there. I think the Steelers. I think the Steelers will say, like, you know what, this guy's earned a bit longer of a leash. Last year he was a rookie. Mitch Trubisky was a newcomer, and they knew that, you know, as long as TJ Watt was healthy, that they were going to be able to play really good defensive football, keep games close, and as long as the offense didn't turn the ball over an insane amount, they'd have a good chance of winning a football game, as you know, in most situations. And that was what got them 9 wins, was that formula. But now this year, that formula, I think, has to be different. This offense needs to at least be able to score anywhere between 22 to 27 points per game on an average. And again, that's just like, just get there, and then we can start talking about other things. But if they're continuing to win games, you know, like they have the last few years, where again, 8 of their 9 wins in 2021 came when opponents were scoring 20 or less points. And then this year, it was pretty much the same thing. In fact, all the wins came when their opponents were scoring 20 or less points. It's been that way for 2 seasons now, and really 3 of the last 4 when you consider 2019. I think that it's time for the offense to take a step up in that direction. We'll talk more about what we need to see from OTAs for things like that to happen, and maybe some underrated storylines that Alan and I are looking at. All that and more here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Stick with us as we continue getting you ready for the start of Steelers OTAs. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Alan Saunders of SteelersNow.com. Alan, one of the facets that we're not going to be able to see of this offense is, and we kind of talked about this during rookie camp, but we're not going to be able to see how physical this offensive line is or how together they are. That's going to, like, as much as the timing, that'll be great to see and everything, but still how his offensive line looks, how they run block for Najee Harris, how all that works together, we're not going to be able to see that until even to like mid to late August. So,
into training camp, like not in the first week of training camp, really, like exactly. into training camp.
Yeah, like this is going to take, like it's going to take like 3 months from now, like before I think we start to get a sense of who these guys are. But there's still new faces. Broderick Jones will be returning. Well, he's basically stayed there since rookie camp. And then you have Isaac Seumalo who's coming in there. And you're going to have an offensive line that's looking to improve. And a lot of what the Steelers offense to get there, I think, depends on them. But there's also questions about how does the running game look in the backfield itself. We know Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren are effective here. I got a question here from one of our callers, Joe from Westchester, asking about who else is going to be in it. Yes, Westchester, PA. We get calls from all over, baby. Here's Joe with a question about who's going to fit in behind the 2 top running backs.
Hey, Chris, it's Joe in Westchester, Pennsylvania. I had a question for you regarding running back 3 for the Steelers this year. It may sound a bit silly, but seeing that the Steelers are presumably going to be much more run-heavy team this upcoming year, is it out of the question to consider who may be able to fit the running back 3 spot? I know we have Najee and Jaylen, obviously a really good 1 and 2, but it really wouldn't hurt to have that number 3. I kind of look at a team like the Ravens or even the the Eagles of that 2017-2018 season when they won the Super Bowl. So let me know what you think. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Joe, for your question. If you ever want to get your question on the air, call 412-223-6644, and you can get your question in, leave your name, where you're from, and keep your question under a minute. We'll try to get you on the show. And if you donate $10, at least $10 or more to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation under the link that I provided, or on the QR code that I provided here on screen here, you'll get your question answered on the show within a week of your donation. We get a lot of calls, so I don't always get to all of them, but we try to get to the one. We will definitely get to the ones of the people who donate to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation in that fight. But Alan, as I look at it now, the Steelers, they just let go of Master Teague. I so badly want him to just be on the roster. I love that name. Just Master Teague the third. It's not even just Master Teague, but he's been released from the team. But it looks like to me, third running back is going to be Anthony McFarland, and I don't think there's really much to be mad about that because he's a change of pace from the other 2 guys, and that's fine for a third string running back on this team.
Well, I think you have to give the edge to Anthony McFarland, but I will caution that I don't think anybody this time last year was thinking that Jaylen Warren was going to be on the team, right?
Very good point.
There are 2 undrafted guys here in Alfonso Graham out of Morgan State and Jordan Byrd out of San Diego State. Now, they're going to move Byrd around a little bit, but he played running back in college. And these are just 2 smaller, really fast guys. And to me, it's pretty clear this is sort of setting up a battle there for running back 3, which I'm a little confused by. I mean, I don't think that Master Teague was some sort of irreplaceable guy, like obviously, but weird timing for his release. And, Benny Snell's still out there. Is he going to come back? They don't really have what I would call like a true, they have Jaylen Warren, I guess, as the backup to Najee Harris, but usually you want to have a guy in there that you feel like can do it. Anthony McFarland is more like, a bit part guy, third downs only kind of player, and so would probably be Morgan or Byrd if those guys win that job. Instead, they don't really have a third real running back option that I would trust to go play a whole game as a starter. We've seen that guy needed over the last few years. So I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if we see an addition to the running back room, but I think you have to feel pretty good about the 1 and 2. And if that's the big problem heading into the first practice of OTAs, then there are no big problems.
Right. I agree with that. Let's talk a little bit about things they're being overlooked. We've talked a lot about the rookies. We've talked a lot about Broderick Jones, Joey Porter Jr. Yesterday on Monday's episode, I talked a lot about Keanu Benton and how that defensive line is going to look and how I think it could look very strong. What is an aspect of OTAs and what could be sort of learned about over these next few weeks of OTAs that isn't being talked about enough in Pittsburgh media right now?
Oh, well, see, I'm going to talk about all this on my site, SteelersNow.com, about the same time this podcast is coming out. So I'm going to say that all these things I'm going to say, you should also just go to SteelersNow.com and read about them too. But here's my quick, sort of top 5. Does Alex Highsmith show up and is he going to participate? Because contract extension, we've seen this for a couple of years now. When it was Minkah Fitzpatrick's turn, when it was Deontay Johnson's turn, those guys did not. Will he? Won't he? I honestly don't think it matters that much. Alex Highsmith is really good. He probably doesn't need OTAs. And honestly, they probably need a better look at the depth options. Is DeMarvin Leal an outside linebacker? Is Nick Herbig an outside linebacker? If neither of them is an outside linebacker, then who the heck is? I think those are all pretty good questions that we should be looking at this week, certainly. How does Mike Tomlin set up the position battles on the offensive line? This, to me, is one of the great unknowns. Where will the first snap be taken for Dan Moore and Kevin Dotson? Are they going to be in the same places they were last year? Are they going to just move them out of the way and sort of seed that competition and maybe say, okay, these guys might have a better option? Are we going to see a competition at right tackle between Dan Moore and Chooks? Are we going to see Kevin Dotson? Is he going to battle with Seumalo? Is he going to battle with James Daniels? Is somebody going to battle with Ian Cole at center? How does that work? And so I think that's a really interesting part of this as well. And I think that's those to me are the big storylines that I think I'm looking forward to and seeing what we can learn about the way. But I think that is the way. Mike Tomlin loves competition, but he also puts his finger on the scale all the time. You think about that quarterback battle last year. Like, was that a 3-way battle? Sure. Was it really? No. The way he sets these things up matters a lot. And, how's Connor Hayward fit in? I have a pretty good idea of what Darnell Washington is and what he brings to the table. Zach Gentry feels like just like a lot of the same stuff. Do they have room for a fourth tight end? How does he play in? Obviously, I really liked his rookie year, and I think he's a talented player, but it's not the sort of obvious fit that we can sit here and say, oh, this is how it's going to be for him. So I think there's a lot of that that I'm really looking forward to getting our eyes on and seeing what we can learn.
There's a lot of that. I agree. Is going to be a big factor here, and you're right. I think about especially with the offensive line back to them. And again, we're not going to see these guys hitting. We're not going to see any progress there. But Kevin Dotson, I remember last year when we were coming out of OTAs, Kevin Dotson and Kendrick Green were both like, yeah, we're in a 50-50 battle to see who's going to start at left guard. I do not expect that to be the case for Isaac Seumalo. And it's going to be an interesting
Don't expect it to be for James Daniels either, to be perfectly honest.
Okay, now that's a question. Where does James Daniels fit into the picture here? Does he get moved? Is he the one that gets moved and we're overlooking Kevin Dotson sticking in at starter there? Or is there a whole nother jumbled up version of this offensive line that we haven't even considered?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of options there. And Mike Tomlin's held that one pretty close to the vest. And so I think that's one of the big things that we can learn. Obviously, we're not going to be able to make any real conclusions about how guys do. But I think where they start certainly tells a story about what Mike Tomlin is thinking. And we'll see. Like, is Broderick Jones the first rep left tackle? I don't know. I'm a little skeptical of that, but we'll see.
I think he's going to have to earn it like Kenny did. I think that Dan Moore's going to start at that, and then I think by like mid-training camp, you'll see him take it. You'll see him take that spot. But I'm not so sure that Broderick Jones just gets handed that, especially.
I don't think so either. I think we're going to see. If I had to make a prediction, which could be wrong in 12 hours or so, which is generally not a good idea to do, I would say that I think we're going to see Dan Moore start at left tackle and Broderick Jones working with the second team. But I'm not 100% sure about that. It could be different. It'll be. I mean, Omar was talking about how they think Dan Moore can play different positions. You don't say that about a guy that you feel like you have locked in at his spot. Nobody's saying, "Oh, TJ Watt can play different positions." No, like, could he? Yeah, sure, probably, but like, it's not happening. So I think that's interesting to me.
Quick thought before we get out of here, because we've talked a lot of offense. Let's talk a little bit of defense here. Joey Porter Jr. Where do we see him running at the start of OTAs?
Yeah, I mean, to me, probably with the twos at outside corner. I think that's probably where he belongs right now. I think he very well could be there for most of the season. I don't think that's a problem. It's because you just play so many corners. It's not like offensive line where one guy's going to get 80-90% of the reps. Corners are going to move around. I'm more interested to see who goes to the slot. Like where do the slot corners? I mean, I know Shannon Sullivan's going to play there. Maybe going to play there a lot. Trey Norwood, okay. Is Pat Pete going to move inside some? Is Corey Trice going to move inside? I'm interested to see how that shakes out because that's another spot where I don't think there is an obvious answer right now anyway. And again, something that we can learn just by watching where guys line up and not necessarily trying to make big conclusions about how guys do. I'm interested to see how things shake out at strong safety, too, between Keanu Neal and DeMonte KZ. I think I have in my head a pretty good idea what I think they're planning, but I've been wrong before, and we'll see if I'm surprised.
I think there's always surprises to be had when it comes to off seasons and how teams make adjustments. And there's a lot of adjustments that can be made. The Steelers have filled a lot of spots on their roster. This isn't like, I think, in the past years where they've kind of just had to settle at several positions. They've had to settle at some, but I think at a lot, they've given themselves a lot of competition to look over and be excited to watch when the practices get going. And the practices get going Tuesday morning here, where we will be there. Alan will be there. I'll be there. A lot of people will be there covering it. So you'll see all the updates coming from OTAs. Do be excited for that. And we'll keep covering it here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, just like Alan Saunders will keep covering it at SteelersNow.com. Alan, let people they can find you, follow you, get more of your work, and maybe some other things you got lined up.
At @Saunders_PGH on Twitter. PGH Steelers Now is the site on Twitter. SteelersNow.com is the site. You should go there and read all the stuff. Myself and Nick Faribault and the whole team have working. Really just excited to get to OTAs and talk to some guys about football again. I think that's going to be pretty fun. Got a bunch of new guys in the locker room. Yeah, I mean that's kind of, I don't have anything big because I'm just waiting to see what happens. We kind of gotta see how it goes first. We'll be light on our we'll end with a Tomlinism here. A hardcore plan and then be light on our feet. That's the hardcore plan is just to be light on our feet this week. That's all I got.
light on our feet. Look at you being influenced by Mike Tomlin to spread his mechanisms out here through the world. He's Alan Saunders of SteelersNow.com. Thank you so much for joining the show. As always, we'd love to have you back. We'll have you back next week talking more about OTAs as those continue throughout the offseason. I'm your host, Chris Carter, here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Thanks again for checking us out. We'll be back Wednesday with more on your Pittsburgh Steelers after our first session of getting to see OTAs and talk to some of the players that they're back. I'm sure there'll be a lot to talk about. Stick with us. We'll be right here covering your team every day here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.